Good evening. With rising tensions across the world due to the dawn of a new economic ideology in Washington, today's programme dives into the global ripple effects of Donald Trump's second term. In Europe, leaders are struggling to interpret the White House's erratic messaging, caught in a fog of tariffs, defence demands, and a breakdown of traditional alliances. Meanwhile, in the US, Trump is rewriting the economic rulebook with what some are calling direct economics, bypassing experts, institutions, and international norms. I'm Mark Summers. Let's get in focus. As President Trump reshapes America's global priorities, European leaders are finding themselves more sidelined, confused, and politically vulnerable than ever before. From transatlantic tariffs to NATO tensions and Ukraine uncertainty, Europe is confronting a Washington that no longer plays by familiar rules. The Economist reports that Europe is reeling from Trump's latest tariff measures and what it calls strategic contempt. Leaders across the continent are struggling to understand what the US wants as Trump imposes new tariffs on European goods and questions NATO's future. Vice President J.D. Vance and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have taken a scathing tone towards traditional allies, calling them pathetic and freeloaders. As a result, uncertainty clouds everything from Ukraine policy to EU trade relations, with some in Europe wondering whether diplomacy can survive the MAGA era. Now, to analyse how Europe is navigating this transatlantic crisis, we are joined by Greg Swenson, political and economic expert and chairman of Republicans Overseas UK, joining us from London. Nice to have you with us, Greg. So let's start with the big picture. How would you describe Trump's current posture towards Europe?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not hostile. It's more of a reset. I think President Trump has been trying this for 8 years. You know, he had the kind of lockdown conversation in 2018 with the Germans, and I thought he articulated it very well, even though it wasn't very well received, that you must, this constant dependence on Russian oil and then dependence on America for defense and security wasn't going to work in the long haul, in the long term. And so I think he's been pretty clear about this for 8 years. It's only now where he's felt compelled to really draw the line in the sand. And I think that's upsetting to many in Europe, but it's not surprising.
And Trump's 25% tariffs on European cars and aluminium have hit the major EU economies hard. Or at least will do. And we can argue about whether it's aluminum or aluminium at a later date. But is there a long-term goal behind these tariffs?
Yeah, there really is. I mean, it's really two things. One is to, on one hand, make it more fair, make it fair trade, and not have these trade barriers to the United States that we the United States are paying for in our trade deficits with the EU. But also, I think it's more importantly, perhaps, it's to make America more confident and more comfortable in doing the many things that the Europeans want, which is like protecting Europe and providing defense and security. We cannot do that. The U.S. cannot do that as long as we keep running massive trade deficits with Europe, and also when Europe is not actually paying their, I hate to use the word fair share, it's very lefty of me, but not paying their fair share of defense spending. So I think it's a long-term goal of getting Europe to step up and provide for their own defense and security alongside the U.S., but also not depend on the US as the biggest consumer market in the world without opening their markets to the US. So it's kind of a fairness thing, but it's also a reality thing. The United States has $36 trillion in debt. We're paying $1 trillion a year. It sounds like a crazy number, but $1 trillion a year just to service the debt, just in interest payments on the debt. So it's just unsustainable.
And you've just wiped 4 trillion off the stock market. So, I mean, these are big numbers that we're talking about. Now, let's talk a little about the leaked signal chats.
Yeah.
This is where you have Pete Hegseth and also JD Vance being very, very hostile towards Europe and talking
Yeah.
about Europeans being pathetic, freeloaders. And it's a rhetoric they've used in public as well. What does that say about diplomacy? And does Trump share this hostility and disdain for Europe?
Well, I think that might be a little much hostility and disdain. I think it's more of the big brother looking after the little brother. I mean, what JD Vance said in Munich is he wants the UK and Europe to be more responsible and to be better. And I don't think it's hostility, but I do think I thought was really interesting with the signal chats was it wasn't different at all with what they were saying in public, as you pointed out, Mark. So, they're saying it honestly. There's transparency completely. Obviously the signal chat was a mistake, but at least they weren't saying anything in the signal chat that they weren't saying publicly. So I think, the US, the administration wants the best for Europe. What would be really great for Europe is not only for the benefit of the United States to step up some defense and security spending, as well as maybe open up the markets to the United States so there isn't this massive trade deficit, 300 billion a year. That's important, but also what's best for Europe is to liberate their economies, to maybe reduce the welfare state, there's all kinds of things that the European countries can do, and I think their voters want them to do it, which is tax reform, deregulation, the sort of things we're doing in the United States that will help both the Atlantic, help the Atlantic Alliance, help both Europe and the United States.
But how should, leaving Britain out of it, we'll focus on the EU leaders, because they seem very at a loss to know how to deal with this new environment and these kind of statements that you mentioned made by JD Vance in Munich, and also the ones on the chat group. How should they, do you think, deal with it?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing they should do is open up their markets and reduce trade barriers, even, not just tariffs, but non-tariff trade barriers to the United States, so that we can, reduce the trade deficit from the United States perspective, or the trade surplus from the EU perspective. It's $300 billion. We have to borrow money to fund those deficits. And again, our basically our debt is at a crisis level right now at 36 trillion. So, that would be assisting the United States, but also making it more equal, making it more fair trade, so that our producers can make money just like the European producers do. That's the first step. But I do think that also there's some cultural issues, some philosophical issues where, and I think JD Vance pointed those out in Munich, where you have a continent, you have the Western European countries especially, that are not really aligned with the traditional democratic values that we, the Atlantic Alliance, have always cherished. So I think some of these things like free speech, you have voters moving to the right, yet the governments in Western Europe are sticking with their playbook, which is climate alarmism and mass immigration, both of which the voters don't like. So, there's some political and philosophical issues here, but I think we start with the economic issues and liberate the economies, liberate the energy sector for sure. And that's something that Americans really believe in. But I think that we would hope that our European allies and trading partners would feel the same way.
I mean, Ursula von der Leyen says she feels let down by our oldest ally.
Yeah.
And then you have the rhetoric from Trump saying that the EU was created in order to destroy America, or more or less
Yeah,
words to that effect. Is this all hyperbole? Do you think
I I
are,
think so.
are the EU and the United States still allies?
Yes, definitely. And I do think that there's some merit to both of those arguments. But I think that I think what she was saying is that, we are pushing back, and that's quite right to push back. In other words, they've been taking advantage of the American, trading policies, which has basically been a mistake for maybe 40 years, at least 25, especially with China. But the fact that we've opened our markets to the EU, and yet the EU hasn't really opened their markets to us completely. So you have a $300 billion trade deficit. Again, we have to finance that by selling bonds, by issuing debt and borrowing money. And so we're essentially the American taxpayer is funding the welfare states of Europe, right? You have, the 6 weeks holiday, the, free healthcare, all of that
And I know you
business.
don't like a welfare state, Greg.
No, no, of course not. And because they don't work, and I think if they did work, we'd be all for it. But unfortunately, they don't. We've realized that with communism and socialism and the failures of those economic ideologies. And so, we would prefer that the European governments were more aligned with what we are aligned with, but that doesn't matter. If they want to do that, if they want to maintain these welfare states, that's great. Just don't make me pay for it. It's the attitude that I think we're seeing from President Trump.
Now, as an American Republican conservative voice who lives in the UK, why is it? What drew you to the United Kingdom, which is a country, as you say, doesn't really have the values that you normally uphold? You don't like a healthcare system. You don't like a welfare state. You don't like big
Yeah.
government, which is the hallmark of most of the rest of the Western world outside of the United States.
Yeah.
What makes you live in a country like that?
No, it's a great question. And I think when I moved here 10 years ago, it was not quite the welfare state that it is now. And you saw the beginnings of mass immigration or mass migration. You saw the beginnings of the woke culture. You saw the beginnings of hostility to free speech. But that's really developed over the last 10 years. The reason that I'm living here is it's the gateway to the rest of the world. It's very much the center of the universe. I do a lot of business in Africa. We build infrastructure, agriculture, resources. So it's important to be here as the gateway to the rest of the world. It has become a bit more of a welfare state. And I don't blame that, by the way, Mark, on the Labor Party, who's only been in power for 9 months. The Conservative Party, the Tories, were basically governing from the center left. And I think that's the trend in Europe. The governing is coming from the center left with, price caps and net zero policies and wealth, obviously massive welfare and all kinds of taxes. And that's Western European policy, although the voters are moving to the right. So I'm actually impressed with the movement to the right from the voters' perspective in Western Europe as well as in the UK, in spite of having a Labour government. So I'm optimistic about this part of the world.
Okay, well, just stay with us because we're going to be back in just a few moments to discuss in more detail the Trump tariffs. But as the US and Europe move forward in an increasingly uncertain alliance, the stakes for diplomacy and stability remain higher than ever. While European leaders attempt to navigate this fog of shifting alliances and strategic pressure, President Trump is also changing the rules of the game at home. His second term has introduced a new economic philosophy, bold, personal, and unorthodox, that's challenging long-held norms in Washington and beyond.
Solemnly swear that I will faithfully take office of President of the United States.
Capitol open, the American and reciprocity.
Mexico.
Canada, Greenland.
I'm also, and I don't.
In Washington, President Trump is challenging not only trade norms, but also the very institutions that define economic policy making. From tariffs to stimulus to gold reserve conspiracies, Trump and his allies are pushing a new populist doctrine that puts executive power at the center of economic life and leaves institutions scrambling to keep up. The Financial Times calls it direct economics, a new Trumpian experiment that bypasses traditional institutions and appeals directly to voters. Whether it's through random tariff decisions, signature-branded stimulus checks, or Elon Musk's cash giveaways, the administration is reshaping how economic power is communicated and executed. Even America's gold reserves at Fort Knox are now part of the populist narrative. While critics warn of volatility and long-term damage, the MAGA movement sees this as an effort to reclaim control from elites and financial technocrats. Now, to discuss how direct economics is reshaping the American economy and politics, Greg Swenson is back with us, the political and economic expert and chairman of Republicans Overseas UK, joining us from London. So this idea of direct economics has been described as bypassing institutions, giving it straight to the voters. Is that a fair characterization of what Trump is trying to do?
Yeah, I think it is, Mark. I think, look, we have an economy for the last 40 years, which has done pretty well. I mean, it's been good for, especially for the people in the top, 10% or the top half of the income spectrum. But, we've had an economy based on offshoring, which, based mostly to China, but other places as well, and then borrowing money. So we have an offshoring and a debt-based economy, which is great for now. But I don't think it's sustainable. And I think President Trump realizes that. And so he's actually playing the long game here. We cannot keep offshoring our critical industries and crushing, the Rust Belt, as it's called. And we can't keep borrowing money. We have $11 trillion of new debt just in the last 4 years from the Biden years. We have 40% of the dollars in circulation were printed in the last 4 years. It's really dangerous. 36 trillion in debt. We're spending $1 trillion a year on interest payments, which is more than we spend on defense. It's really unsustainable.
Trump's tariff policies seem to many intentionally unpredictable. Is it that they're intentionally unpredictable, or is it that he really just doesn't know what he's doing?
No, I think it's the former. Look, he likes to be disruptive. He likes to, throw a grenade in the room every so often or every day. And so it's very disruptive, but I think we need disruptive change right now because of what's been happening really for generations. And so I think it's important that he does throw the grenade in the room and shake the tree a little bit. He's tried to do it politely. As I mentioned earlier, he spoke to the Germans in 2018. Nothing really changed. The EU bought $22 billion of oil, gas, and coal from the Russians last year. So even post-invasion of Ukraine in 2022, we still have a massive amount of spending on energy from Russia. And he pointed that out in 2018. Ronald Reagan said that in 1981. They sort of called it or predicted it. So now I think it's time for radical change because we really need that. We cannot keep sustaining the trade deficits with China and the EU. You
mentioned Reagan there, and I imagine you're a Republican of old, before the MAGA movement, before Trump.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party and Republicans have always been the party of free trade. Was it difficult for you to get on board with the new ethos?
It's a great question. It's interesting, Mark, because many of us were just kind of schooled in that thought that, free trade is good. And we didn't really think about it. We didn't think about what was happening to the Rust Belt, to factory towns. We didn't really think about the fact that, the Chinese we're exporting a lot of goods to America with cheap and in some cases slave labor. And it just didn't bother us because we were buying cheap goods. And it just felt like, you could go to Walmart or Costco and buy cheap stuff from China. So I think there was a bit of an education process. And also, you mentioned Reagan. Reagan actually was not a complete free trader. He put tariffs on Japanese cars. He was very worried about the industrial middle America and actually slapped a lot of tariffs on Japanese cars, which were, basically owning the market in the United States at the time. I have to admit, I bought a Honda when I bought my first car in 1984. So, I think there's some important differences between the perception of Reagan, the free trader, as opposed to Reagan, who was very, very conscious of industrial production in the U.S.
Let's go on to Elon Musk. What's going on with him at the moment? I mean, he's had a bit of a rough time, hasn't he, of late? Obviously, he was quite happy with his chainsaw when he was with his Doge going through and sacking people and gutting government departments. Then he put a lot of money into this race in Wisconsin and lost all his money and was, well, they think it was Elon Musk's fault that the Republicans lost that election. Is he on the way out the door, do you think?
I don't know that. I mean, look, he signed on to this project in a very temporary way, so it's not like he's going to be here for years. I mean, I think it was 18 months that he committed to. If it ends up being 6 months, 12 months, whatever. I mean, I do not think that, Elon Musk will be a permanent fixture in Washington or in government at all. But so whether he leaves tomorrow or in 12 months, it doesn't really matter. I would hope he stays as long as possible.
Do you think Tesla will recover?
I think that's a big issue for him. I think it will recover. They make great cars, I'm told. I don't own one, but this was the most popular electric vehicle in the world, especially in America. Granted, they were getting government subsidies, but I do think it's considered a great vehicle. And it's funny that the people on the left that were the biggest cheerleaders for Tesla because it was saving the planet and avoiding the catastrophe of climate change, yet now they're burning Teslas on the street. I mean, it's kind of perverted to think about it. And I think that but it's obvious, like the stock has taken a hit. He has several companies to look after. So at some point he might feel compelled to look after, his shareholders and look after his companies. But at this time, I think it's great. What he's doing is fantastic. He's cutting waste and fraud and abuse in government. It's long overdue.
That's one perspective on it. Other people would say that he's making a mess of things. He's cutting jobs that need to be there. He's cutting air flight controllers. He's cutting out. It's not just waste that he's cutting. It doesn't seem to be being done with a scalpel, but more of his chainsaw.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of that, and I think there might be some babies thrown out with the bathwater. But look, when Bill Clinton cut 300,000 jobs from government in the 90s, I was cheering. I thought it was a great idea. You didn't hear much pushback from the Democrats. So I think a lot of this is political. That he is doing something that taxpayers love. He's cutting out fraud. He's cutting out waste. It's important to do that. We can't sustain the debt, the $2.5 trillion of budget deficits every year. So something has to be done. You would think people would applaud that. Many of us are, but it is kind of amusing to see the left treat him like he's some kind of a radical when he's actually just making government better.
And there's this conspiracy theory about Fort Knox, where, of course, America keeps its gold, or does it? This is the conspiracy that there's no gold there, I think, isn't it? And Trump said he wants to go and check himself. What is this all about? Isn't it undermining faith in U.S. financial probity?
It's a little bit bizarre. I haven't really followed it. I know so much gold is stored in New York right now, and there's a massive amount of gold coming into the United States right now. I think part of that is concerns about tariffs or potential tariffs on gold, but I also think it's because the big investors, the sovereign wealth funds around the world, are massively interested in investing in the U.S. So they're moving gold there, mostly to the New York Fed. Fort Knox, it's a great question. It's a bit of a conspiracy theory.
Yes.
Often these things turn out to be true, but I won't speculate on that now.
Well, thank you very much once again for joining us here on Q News. Greg Swenson, thank you very much for being here. As America blazes a new trail in economic policy, the implications for global markets and US democracy are only beginning to unfold. From Europe's confusion over US alliances to the spectacle of direct economics, Donald Trump's second term is shaking the foundations of traditional diplomacy and world finance. Whether this leads to reinvention or rupture, one thing is clear: the world is watching. We'll continue to keep it in focus. See you next time.